In this next session, we'll start looking at how to use the landscape tool. This is quite a detailed tool, and while I've gone through it in great depth in Unreal 4 on how to use this, I'll only be covering some of the very brief and basic ways to get started here. If you are interested in learning more of them, please check out the Unreal 4 tutorials that I have, as the methodology still remains the same even in the new Unreal 5 engine. However, this next part of the tutorial will just be enough to get you started so that we can have a backdrop within our level, and then we can continue on using the foliage tool and decorating our level. To get to the landscape mode, I simply click up here and go to landscape. It will give me a preview of what the landscape will look like and how far away into the distance it will start sending itself. We probably don't need a landscape as big as this, so I'm going to start reducing down the selection. As you can see here, the location of it is also 700 on the Z axis. You may want to check that to make sure that it's not going to start protruding through your level. The other thing you'll notice is that you have materials here where it says none. For now, I'm just going to put in a simple grass texture. With these quad sections, I could reduce these down, but you also have to remember that every time you reduce them down, you also lose some resolution here. And so it can be wise sometimes to keep it just a little bit bigger, just to make it easier for you when you are sculpting or painting. As I said, this is just going to be a short introduction, so looking into more of these details and also how to import files in will be something that you might want to investigate in our other tutorial series, where we go through the basics of how to import height maps and apply more complicated materials. For now, we're just going to select grouse and ground and click create. As you can see, because of the position that it was on the z-axis, this has now gone above the level. But this is okay, as I'll show you now. In order to be able to sculpt a landscape, all we need to do is left click and drag on here, and you can see that the elevation starts to increase. If we want to decrease it, we can simply hold the shift key and click down until we hit the bottom of our level here. Keeping in mind, we might still want to be able to have some control over here to be able to do our road. So I just want you to work on the areas in the horizon. These areas aren't going to necessarily need to be playable, they're just going to act as a backdrop so that when our character looks into the distance, they don't just see a blank sky. Get used to this and practice some, and just sort of see what types of brushes you can use in order to make different effects. The flatten brush, for example, can be used in order to be able to flatten out areas. Holding down shift and left clicking will almost certainly smooth, or you can click on this smooth tool to go there. And ramps as well can be used in order to get from one elevation to the other. For example, by clicking here and then clicking on the top here and then pressing enter, it will now create a ramp for us. Remember, while it is fun to be able to use these tools and create large worlds, we want to try and keep our ambitions lower so that we don't end up losing time to learning skills and then not learning the fundamentals. But by all means, take this time now to just play around and experiment with different brushes and try and get different hard edges and different effects to see what works for you in your level design. With the flatten tool here, we want to be able to flatten our tool so that we have enough of it poking out that it covers this grey static mesh here, but not so much so that we can't actually use it. In order to do that, we're going to actually experiment with the actual lock size. To do this, we're going to flatten to target. If we flatten to target, it will not only take the average of where it's placed, but look to a specific target to flatten it to, and then hold it to that level. As we can see, the flattened target at 0 has worked out really well for our level, as this happens to also be just above the mesh that we had at the start of our level design here. What's good about this is that now that we have done with that and we've marked out our general area, we can go out of landscape mode and back to that floor, and from here we can move it down so that it's out of the way. We can always bring it up later, but for now we're going to bring that down. What you'll notice is that the foliage that was once parented to that particular mesh here is now disappearing with it as well. but we'll readjust the foliage now to only paint on the landscape to make sure that we don't have foliage appearing on our static meshes. To do that, we'll go back to foliage mode and we'll start painting in. We can also use other elements in our foliage now as well, such as rocks and even the occasional flower, to be able to break up the monotony. Our eyes pick up on repetition, so it's important to try and use as many different things to break up the repetition of something. The more repetition we have, the more easily our eyes are able to pick out that something has been placed to a pattern. In order to deactivate any of these, you can simply click on the checkbox next to it in order to then remove that from the selection. Keep in mind, if you want to be able to erase them entirely, they still need to be selected here as well. So I'm going to hold down Shift and deselect those rocks there. I'm now going to cut in a small path that goes here. In order to do that, I'm going to go to use our Flatten tool again, inside of our Landscape tool first, and then I'm going to start creating grooves on the side here. To do that, I'll go Flatten, except this time I will move just slightly below the surface. I'm also going to make sure that the brush is not as soft in order to try and make sure that it's not going to be too slight. I'm also going to pick the brush size and lower it down quite significantly to make for a more narrow pathway. You can then pull the fall off. And now, as we cut into here, we can see this is far too low. So I will simply change this from 0 to 0.1. And that's too slight. So I will go with minus 0.5. As with all things, it just becomes about experimentating. You just need to be able to keep going until you find exactly what it is you want. This one looks good, so I'll be using this one. Now that we have a small groove here, I'm going to readjust how these actors are placed to be able to fall in line with our road. Now that we have this road, I want to actually be able to paint on a different material. But as we can see with this landscape here, we only have one material to paint. If we go here to Landscape and then Paint, we'll see that we only have one layer for that. Later on, when we start talking about materials, I'll come back to this and explain how it is that you can create a material and pull it into here. But for now, I'm just going to leave that there and we'll come back to that later.